But I already see a problem because I'm already doing the math. And the way that I see it, Soda Stereo needs its own episode. Caifanes needs its
Yeah,
own episode, and Maná needs its own episode. Café Tacuba. So that's what I'm saying, that they need another season of this, because the impact that Soda Stereo has had out of Argentina, and both Caifanes and Maná out of Mexico, it's been huge in terms of this
yeah.
genre. And I hope that they do those bands justice. You are listening to the Brown Perspective. What is going on? So I finally got around to watching a few of the episodes of the series on Netflix, Rompan Todo. And I know that you, Eduardo, already got a chance to watch all 6 of them. So why don't we talk a bit about the first 3 episodes and our reaction to this genre of music that has played such an important role in our lives?
Queremos más rock.
Yeah, I actually thought it was a either just a documentary, like a 1.5 hour documentary. I was pleasantly surprised that it was a few episodes, because as soon as I watched the first one, I was immediately hooked, and I wanted to keep
Yes.
watching. I knew I wasn't gonna be able to finish watching all of them, but
Por fin me hacen caso. When I recommend something, because I want you to savor it, my friend.
okay, so it's all right. So I will give your recommendations more weight in the time being until you recommend the bad one, and then you're gonna fall off the list.
It's bound to happen. It's
Yeah,
bound
I
to
mean,
happen.
there's
As
yeah.
I said that, I realized that I probably setting up an impossible standard.
All right. So just look off the top, some of the things that I picked up on immediately. That this genre has suffered for a long time the criticism that it's it imitates a lot
Hmm.
from movements and styles from the Americas. And we can debate whether or not the later rock de los ochentas and the 90s still had that problem, but definitely in the beginning I got the sense that this is definitely imitation, more imitation than inspiration. The music that you were seeing out of Argentina and out of Mexico, and even Chile, because those that's actually the other thing that initially they're focusing a lot on those 3 countries: Mexico, Argentina, and Chile,
Hmm.
and then the political struggle. Uh, the other thing that stood out to me is the that a lot of these teens that were playing this music, it's really like the middle class of Mexico, Argentina, and Chile that are gravitating towards this style of music. Was that your impression as well of those 2 things that I mentioned?
Yeah, it was because part of it was a lot of bohemios, right? A lot of folks who are going to school or young, and who had the opportunity, the time, and the inclination to pick up an instrument and play music and join bands. So yeah, I definitely felt like it was the type of phenomenon that really took root within those who could afford it, and also those who could were exposed to music, right? Because I mean, they were also influenced by the Beatles and Rolling Stones and some of the great rock and roll bands of that were on going on in the 40s and 50s. And then I think that eventually they got introduced into the rhythm and blues and some of the African American sounds,
Yeah.
and the original contributions of I guess the founders of rock and roll, you can say.
Yeah, and there's a few things there that a few boxes that have to be checked off in order for somebody to get into this type of music. First of all, you have to have, like you said, you have to be able to afford the instruments. You have to have enough the privilege of having the time to devote to this hobby. And I don't, I wasn't around in the 50s in Mexico and Argentina, but in terms of access, so where the internet wasn't around, I don't think working class poor families really had TVs back then. Maybe some people had radio, but
Hmm.
I don't think everyone had radio. So you had to have that access to begin with. And then on top of that, even if you had access to the music, you had to live in communities that wouldn't try to shame you so much for trying to for being so different. Because you can think of somebody in the 50s in a small town in Mexico, if they were caught listening to this music, they would be you would become like an outcast in a way. In the sense that you would get so much criticism that you would essentially be like snapped back into conformity because it would be such big pressure to conform to the norms of that small community. So it makes sense that it takes root in the big cities where there's more people that are more open to experiment and more open to like outside influences.
The metropolitan feel. And I think the other theme that this gets to is for the longest time, a lot of people in Latin America want to be like the US, right? They want to aspire to be either like the US or like Europe, because I think that's part of the colonial desire that was instilled in us, that those things that are better are the things that are British, the things that are American, the things that are European versus.
Yep.
So when it first started, it was that to a large extent, a full embrace of that foreign influence. And it wasn't until later that some of the beautiful, rich sounds of Latin America became part of this music, and that they really went from being rock en español to being música alternativa latina.
Yeah, that's right. And also, in the first episode, they talk about what a big influence the Beatles was on this genre of music in Latin America. And as you were talking about the influences that came from abroad, I just realized that they mentioned the Beatles. They mentioned some of the early rock and roll coming out of the U.S., Richie Valens as well. Mm-hmm. But they didn't mention at all any of the African-American rock and roll singers. Like no Chuck Berry. And even though a lot of the songs that I was listening to in the first episodes were derivatives of the Beach Boys, even into the second and third episode, derivatives of the Beach Boys, which copied off of Chuck Berry. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know if this is intentional or if this plays into some of the subconscious racism even within Latinos to not even acknowledge the black roots of this music, because they definitely gave a nod to the influence that the English music had, like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and then to some of the American the influences from America as well, but not to the African American side.
Yeah, and I think it was only until I think there was one Mexican artist that did sort of bring that blues and that African influence, and I think he was also close to Santana. So I think it was around that time where he brought that sound, and where Santana, who grew up in the border, kind of also picked that up. So I think it was also interesting to see how the border and Tijuana, San Diego area, and other parts where there's a lot of mixing of cultures, how some of that African American influence did finally make it, and I think it took from there. And I'm trying to remember what the name of the musician was, but he's really, really funny.
Yeah, he's the one in the first episode. I know which one you're talking about, but so don't get me wrong. We're saying the same thing. The influence, a lot of it comes from the origins are from the African American creation. So so that guy playing blues, and not just the blues, all the other ones playing rock, it can be traced back to sounds that were originated in the African American community. Mm-hmm. But there's no mention of I drew some inspiration from this artist or from this other artist. It seems to begin with the Beatles when they start referencing specific artists, and then Bob Dylan, and then the Rolling Stones. So really, it coincides with the British invasion, which makes sense. Mm-hmm. That's when this thing went global, because even though there was a scene of rock en español in the Americas before that, that's really when it blew up. But I'm just surprised that the documentary didn't even give a nod to the original creators, the creators of the original rock, right?
Yeah,
so that's just interesting.
That's true, and the name of the musician is Javier Batiz.
Yeah,
in Tijuana, so rock and roll legend. And I know we'll you're just in episode 3, but the other thing that I'll point out that, and it's a reflection of what happens, but women in the genre really don't come up until the last episode, and I feel that
no, there was just one.
Yeah, just one. But I think towards the end, there's more conversation with with Julieta Venegas, with some other Argentinian female artists who started to get some play. But I think if there's another season of this documentary, I hope that they will focus more on those stories as well.
I really do hope that there's another season, and the reason is I'm already done with the third episode, and the whole time when I started watching this, I kept waiting for Caifanes, for Maná, for Soda Stereo, for Gustavo Cerati, and they're nowhere to be
They'll get
seen.
there.
What's that?
You'll get there. They're in the I think some of the other episodes that are coming up,
But see,
episodes 4, 5, and 6.
but I already see a problem because I'm already doing the math, and the way that I see it, Soda Stereo needs its own episode. Caifanes needs its
Yeah,
own episode, and Maná needs its own episode. Café Tacuba. So that's what I'm saying, that they need another season of this, because the impact that Soda Stereo has had out of Argentina, and both Caifanes and Maná out of Mexico, it's been huge in terms of this
yeah,
genre. And I hope that they do those bands justice. I'm not taking anything away from the bands before the 80s. I actually didn't really know any of them. Just the only one is El Tri. But in the first two seasons, all 50s, 60s, and 70s, I didn't know any of those bands.
yeah. Same here. And for me, it's funny because I love music, and I had heard of some of these artists, but I certainly did not have an idea of why Soda Stereo was so influential and so impactful. And even Gustavo Cerati, I had no idea of his genius until I saw this documentary. So for me, it was just kind of giving me so much more context and educating me into some of the folks that I always listened and party to. And when I play at parties, that people love those songs, right? You put Tren al Sur, you
Hmm.
put Lamento Boliviano, you put so many other songs, and people just go crazy.
Yeah, those are all the bands that we grew up with, because they're bands that started probably in the late 70s. I know Maná started in the late 70s with a band called Sombrero Verde. And then if you listen to Maná in the late 70s, what you're listening to is just a imitation of the Police, really. That's
Mm.
And then Caifanes also started around that time, and they sounded very generic. They sounded like they were doing covers of American bands. But then
Mhm.
towards the 80s, they started getting their own sound, and especially Caifanes, they started fusing a lot of it with the indigenous culture, and they started getting a really unique sound that was incredibly appealing also. And it was because they were coming out with good music. Those have been the soundtrack of my youth with rock en español, and especially in the 90s, right? So a few others like Los Prisioneros, Los Enanitos Verdes. But I'm hoping that there's a second season, and they can devote a lot more time to these guys. I know that the pioneers are important, but these guys are really, I think, the ones in the 80s, the ones that really pushed this genre to like new heights.
Yeah,
And go ahead.
yeah, and I know one of the themes that you wanted to touch upon is sort of the way that politics and the political situation in each of these countries plays into how these genre developed, right? And I
Yeah,
think
and
to a large
tragic.
extent, the
Yeah.
extent it gives it that social critique that also makes the music so appealing and so raw.
Yeah, I found it interesting that even though this was a genre that was mainly being driven by a middle class youth, how there was so much repression,
Hmm.
especially well, in all the countries, different forms of repression, but each country had its own unique turmoil, with the dictatorship in Chile, and then the repression in Mexico. Especially, it was so rock and roll is that genre that's so easy to label it as demonic music, depending on how far right you get in the religious spectrum. It's really easy to label it as something that is corrupting the youth. And
Hmm.
Mexico being such a the
Conservative place.
yeah, conservative, with Catholicism having such a stronghold on the culture, then no surprise that they immediately identified it and called it out as a problematic form of music that is corrupting the youth. And so these middle class teenagers were suffering their own form of repression, um,
Just
different
because of the
and
way they look, right?
yeah, and also because of their political message, and this takes me to the I think the second episode is probably the best one or my favorite right now because it talks about Victor Jara, political activist,
La
and in
nueva
terms
canción chilena.
yeah, in terms of his message and what he stood for. And obviously, I mean, for those that may not know the history, when Salvador Allende took his own life, they captured Victor Jara and they tortured him, and again to send the message that they weren't gonna tolerate that. And so what's interesting is that when I was watching the first episode and then up until the part where they got to Chile, that's I just felt like, oh, this music is it just sounds, it's a derivative of American music. It I know they're maybe they think they're innovating or they're trying to innovate, but to me it just sounds like movement or music that came out in the U.S. a few years before. And it wasn't until the part with Victor Jara that I started hearing something different. Yeah, they started
Yeah.
fusing the rock with the traditional elements, and I thought, okay, this is starting to sound more like its own. It has its own signature. It has its own uniqueness.
Hmm. Definitely. I think Victor Jara, when you think of Mercedes Sosa and some of the other artists that, were artists and going back to the type of repression that was taking place in these countries and how beautiful it was that through music they tried to express what was going on, their feelings, their frustrations. And I think that's such a powerful thing about the that the documentary captures, that in so many ways a lot of these artists, the reasons why they love music so much and why they're willing to get arrested and be beaten and tortured is because they feel that they have something to say, something to express that immediately connects with a lot of the people who are listening to the music, and then they realize how relatable that is in other parts of the world, and particularly the Latin American continent.
Yeah, and a lot of them were risking their safety just to keep playing this music. They had to go underground, which again, just the parallels with this type of music being considered rebellious music in the United States. Whereas in the United States, it took on a form of a threat to like segregation, because a lot of the
Hmm.
culture didn't like the fact that now young white teens were embracing African American music. Even though the music itself was considered rebellious, people's lives weren't really at risk. Whereas in Latin America, the same music, the same type of rebellious message, uh, could potentially be detrimental to your health for singing that same type of music. So in a way, it's even more hardcore in Latin
Hmm.
America because these guys were doing it despite all that. Not to say that in the U.S. the musicians wouldn't have kept doing it, but just the risk level was completely different.
Yeah, and when you think of Woodstock and what happened there, and what was going on with the Vietnam War, and yes, I mean there was certainly um, a military and police repression here in the U.S., but to your point, it wasn't as extensive or as severe um, as it was in Latin America.
The protections that they have against the police state just weren't the same. So
Hmm.
yeah, it's just interesting. So anyway, pretty good series. Highly recommended.
Two thumbs up.
Yeah, so far it's good. I do wish that they would spend that they would have identified or they would have highlighted the roots of the genre to begin with,
Hmm.
right? That going back to the black community, and also 3 episodes in and no mention of Caifanes. Come on, and you gotta throw me a bone here, and give me something. They definitely feature them here in the cover.
I think that's Gustavo
Yeah,
Cerati.
it's hard to find them when they're young, but yeah. Anyway, so looking forward to watching the next 3 episodes, and I think once I do get around to that, I'd like to have a second discussion on this to talk about the second half of this series.
Man, you're so excited about it that you're making me want to watch it again, which I'll probably do just because I do. I'm sure I'll get and be able to pick up so much more second time around.
Yeah, man,
But
you don't know. So my mixtapes in the '90s were one side rock en español, other
damn,
side románticas. I really did have that. My mixtape was one side was rock en español and the other side was like Cristian Castro and Faye.
Lloran las rosas.
I think I had Conjunto Primavera there too. Yeah, dude, it was crazy. Mixtapes. Oh, the young generation will never know about mixtapes.
I know. I wish I had a pencil right now so I can rewind my cassette so I can fix it and put some tape. I know that those were the days. Maybe we'll do a whole episode dedicated to getting music and recording music back in the day when you didn't have all this technology this young kids have. Get off my lawn, kids.
Yeah.
Get off my lawn.
And also just a nod to Victor Jara so that his spirit and his struggle lives on. There is a band called Calexico that has a song called Victor Jara's Hands. Yeah, so just for people out there, check it out. It's a pretty good song.
Yeah, some of those songs I know are so deep, so emotional. I know that oftentimes when I hear those songs, like I almost they just get to the soul. I mean
Yeah.
the lyrics, the music, the sound is just like such a gifted artist.
Yeah,
So
and
it's amazing.
this is an American band, so it's nice to see them paying respects to Victor Jara. All right, let's wrap this up. Anything else?
No, that's it. Go watch it. Uh, if you like it, let us know. You can put your comments here. You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube. You again are listening to the Brown Perspective, and we hope you'll stay tuned for some additional episodes. And I'll throw it back to you, RO.
All right, nos vemos.
Ciao.